April 23, 1945, Berlin, Alexanderplatz district. The metallic bark of automatic fire echoed off shattered storefronts as Private Dmitry Volkov pressed himself against a bullet-pocked wall, his PPSH-41 submachine gun suddenly feeling inadequate in his calloused hands. Across 30 meters of rubble-strewn street, an SS trooper crouched behind an overturned streetcar, and in his grip was something Volkov had only glimpsed twice before, a weapon that fired with a different rhythm, a controlled thunder that spoke of technological superiority the propaganda officers insisted didn't exist. This is the story of how one captured firearm became the most coveted trophy on the Eastern Front, a symbol that exposed uncomfortable truths about industrial might, tactical evolution, and the bitter mathematics of prestige versus practicality in the final year of history's bloodiest war. The Sturmgewehr 44, literally assault rifle 44, represented something unprecedented in military history. Developed between 1942 and 1944, it was the world's first mass-produced rifle combining selective automatic fire with an intermediate cartridge, the 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz round. Where the Red Army's standard-issue Mosin Nagant bolt-action rifle required 5 seconds between shots, and the PPSH-41 submachine gun sprayed inaccurately beyond 100 meters, this German innovation bridged both worlds. A Red Army private, holding an STG-44, possessed accurate automatic fire out to 300 meters, while maintaining the compact maneuverability needed for urban warfare. But here's where the story twists into something darker and more complicated. By the spring of 1945, Soviet trophy brigades, specialized units formed increasingly from 1943 onward, had systematically stripped hundreds of thousands of German weapons from battlefields stretching from Stalingrad to the outskirts of the Reichstag. These teams logged, photographed, and shipped high-value captures to rear depots with bureaucratic precision that rivaled the German obsession with documentation. Commanders often allotted captured pistols or exotic submachine guns as battlefield rewards, small tokens of recognition in an army where bread rations averaged a few hundred grams per day, and survival itself was the ultimate prize. The STG-44 sat at the apex of this trophy hierarchy. Before we go further into why Soviet soldiers would risk everything to possess this weapon, please take a moment to comment below where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you're finding this story as fascinating as the soldiers who lived it, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this remarkable tale. Production numbers tell the first layer of the story. Total wartime output of the MP-43, MP-44, and STG-44 variants reached approximately 425,000 rifles, manufactured between mid-1943 and April 1945. Production concentrated in 4 principal plants: Haenel in Suhl, Sauer and Sohn, Erfurt, and Steyr-Daimler-Puch in Austria, splitting the output under increasingly desperate wartime conditions. Material shortages, Allied bombing, and worker deficits strangled production far below the ambitious quotas calling for 1.5 to 4 million units. This scarcity transformed each captured STG-44 from mere equipment into legend. By May 8 through 9th, 1945, VE Day, millions of German small arms lay piled in collection points across conquered territory. Mauser K98K rifles, Luger pistols, Walther P38s, and the revolutionary STG-44s awaited Soviet trophy brigades who documented and sorted captured weapons for redistribution or long-term storage. One estimate suggests the Red Army had approximately 102,000 STG-44s in custody by 1948. After consolidating both battlefield captures and post-war surrender stockpiles. 102,000 rifles? For context, that's roughly equivalent to arming every soldier in 5 full Soviet rifle divisions. Yet, scattered across millions of troops, these weapons remained rare enough that possessing one marked you as special, a survivor, a soldier who had taken the best the SS could offer and lived to carry it. The weapon itself was unmistakable. Wooden furniture contrasted with a stamped steel receiver blackened by factory bluing. The 30-round curved box magazine jutted downward at a distinctive angle. Soviet troopers called exotic German small arms Nemetsky Automat, German automatic, when bragging to comrades during evening cigarette breaks, and the STG-44 occupied the summit of that informal pecking order, trophy of fate. In many frontline letters and memoirs, soldiers equated capturing an SS-issued or elite-marked German weapon with tangible proof of combat prowess, evidence that you had beaten a better-equipped opponent and survived to take his gear. The weapon became more than steel and wood. It crystallized into a status object polished to a shine, its gas system cleaned obsessively, sometimes marked with troop-drawn insignia that transformed it into an informal prize rifle shown off during rare moments of downtime. But beneath the prestige lurked a problem that would haunt every Soviet soldier who liberated one from enemy hands. The STG-44 fired the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz cartridge, an intermediate round that wasn't part of Red Army logistics. A captured rifle without accompanying German ammunition was effectively a 10-pound paperweight, a prestige trophy rather than a practical weapon. Frontline letters shifted in tone from envy to pragmatic frustration. A soldier might brag about a seized Luger PS08 pistol, but then complain bitterly about the scarcity of matching 9x19mm rounds at platoon resupply. "We took their gun, but not their bullets." That phrase, repeated in multiple post-war accounts, captured the bittersweet essence of trophy culture on the Eastern Front. You could hold German engineering superiority in your hands, feel its balanced weight, admire its innovative design, but without ammunition, the most advanced assault rifle in the world was just an expensive club. So, why did soldiers still risk everything to capture them? Why did entire squads coordinate assaults just for the chance to strip weapons from fallen SS troops? And what happened when Soviet weapons engineers got their hands on intact examples and began to understand what they were really looking at? The answers would reshape Cold War small arms development and expose uncomfortable truths about how quickly battlefield trophies transform from practical tools into symbols of something far more complex. Late winter, 1944, a railhead somewhere between Minsk and Warsaw, coal smoke curled through diesel tang while men chewed black bread, and along a makeshift weapons rack stood a row of captured rifles, frost crystallizing on their muzzles like decorative lace. One soldier's tactical advantage is another man's haunting question. What does it mean when your enemy's standard-issue weapon outperforms everything in your arsenal? The STG-44's battlefield performance exposed a gap in Soviet small arms doctrine that commanders pretended didn't exist. The weapon fired at a cyclic rate around 540 rounds per minute, slower than the PPSH-41's frantic 900, but with devastating accuracy at ranges where the submachine gun's pistol-caliber rounds tumbled uselessly. At 100 to 300 meters, engagement distances that defined most Eastern Front firefights, the German assault rifle dominated. A single soldier with an STG-44 could suppress an entire Soviet squad, forcing men to ground while German infantry maneuvered for flanking positions. Senior Sergeant Vasily Grossman, the war correspondent whose frontline dispatches later became legendary, noted the psychological weight of facing this weapon in urban combat. The sight of a steady German automatic at 200 meters could freeze attacking squads until suppressive fire arrived, he wrote, describing the paralysis that gripped men when they recognized the distinctive silhouette and that controlled, hammering bark. The tactical mathematics were brutal and simple. A Red Army rifle squad in 1944 typically carried a mix of Mosin-Nagant bolt actions and a few PPSH-41 submachine guns. The Mosin-Nagants, reliable, accurate, deadly at range, required manual operation between each shot. The PPSH submachine guns excelled in trench raids and room clearing, but sprayed inaccurately beyond close quarters. Between these two extremes existed a tactical void, a dead zone of engagement distance where neither weapon performed optimally. The Germans had identified this gap years earlier and engineered a solution. The 7.92 by 33mm Kurz cartridge sat perfectly between full-power rifle rounds and pistol ammunition. Its lighter recoil allowed controllable automatic fire. Its streamlined bullet retained enough energy for lethal effect at intermediate ranges, and the 30-round detachable box magazines, curved slightly to accommodate the tapered cartridge, provided sustained firepower without the awkward drum magazines that Soviet submachine gunners had to wrestle during reloads. In street fighting, Stalingrad, Budapest, later Berlin, these advantages multiplied. The STG-44's overall length measured just 37 inches with its stock extended shorter than a K198K rifle by nearly 7 inches. In the confined geometry of ruined buildings, that difference meant the ability to pivot through doorways, snap the weapon up staircases, engage targets in tight corridors without the muzzle catching on debris. Soviet assault troops who temporarily acquired these weapons reported a revelation. Room-to-room combat transformed from desperate knife-distance brawling into controlled medium-range engagements where superior firepower dictated outcomes. Captured German training manuals, studied by Soviet intelligence officers, revealed doctrine built around the STG-44's capabilities. German squads, with even 2 or 3 assault rifles, could establish immediate fire superiority, pinning opponents while riflemen advanced under covering fire. The weapon changed small unit dynamics in ways that Soviet tactical planners found deeply troubling. The enemy had built a better mousetrap, but tactical superiority meant nothing without ammunition, and here the trophy's curse revealed itself with bitter clarity. The intermediate 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz existed nowhere in Soviet supply chains. Platoon quartermasters carried requisition lists for 7.62 by 54 mm Mosin rounds, 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev pistol ammunition, and 7.62 by 38 mm PPSH cartridges. German Kurz ammunition appeared only where German logistics had been, in overrun supply trucks, abandoned ammunition dumps, or the pouches of dead soldiers. Frontline ingenuity emerged from necessity. Soviet soldiers who captured STG-44s learned to strip ammunition from every German corpse they encountered, hoarding loose rounds in bread bags, cartridge belts, even empty food tins. Squads lucky enough to overrun a German supply depot would divide captured ammunition with the intensity of men splitting diamonds. 20 rounds here, 30 rounds there. Each magazine loaded became a finite resource, expended only when absolutely necessary. Some soldiers reportedly fired their trophy rifles only once or twice during subsequent combat, preferring to preserve both weapon and ammunition as talismans rather than tools. Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Kalinin, no relation to the Soviet head of state, wrote in a letter that survived censorship about finding an intact German weapons cache near Königsberg. Wooden crates stacked like cordwood, he described, each one stenciled with eagle stamps and packed with ammunition in paper-wrapped bundles. My platoon spent an entire evening dividing the Kurz cartridges, and men nearly came to blows over who deserved extra magazines. We had captured 15 STG-44s in the previous week's fighting, but barely 300 rounds between them. The ammunition famine created a shadow economy at the front. Captured German rounds became informal currency, traded for vodka rations, extra bread, even leave time. A full 30-round magazine could buy a soldier's way out of a dangerous night patrol. An entire ammunition crate might secure a 3-day pass to a rear area rest station. Trophy brigades, aware of this underground market, tried to control captured ammunition distribution, but enforcement was impossible across hundreds of kilometers of fluid front lines. Field armorer teams stripped captured STG-44s for maintenance, replacing corroded springs and worn gas tubes with parts cannibalized from damaged weapons. These specialists stamped crude Russian inventory marks onto receivers before shipping rifles to depot storage. Cyrillic characters impressed into German steel, a physical record of ownership transfer. But even refurbished rifles sat useless in warehouses without compatible ammunition, and by March 1945, German Kurz production had become sporadic at best, as Allied bombing disrupted supply chains. There's a deeper irony here, though. German testing and wartime reports praised the STG-44 as exceptionally reliable in extreme cold compared to other German semi-automatic designs. On the Eastern Front, where winter temperatures could plummet to -30°C and turn inadequately lubricated weapons into frozen paperweights, this cold weather reliability should have made captured rifles invaluable. Soviet soldiers discovered that the stamped steel receiver and simple gas piston system continued functioning when more complex designs failed, when ice formed in actions and oil congealed to sludge. Yet reliability meant nothing when magazines sat empty. The weapon's maintenance requirements added another layer of frustration. The STG-44's magazine lips and feed geometry proved more delicate than the robust PPSH drum magazines that could survive being dropped from trucks or buried in mud. One veteran noted in a later interview that captured Kurz magazines liked to bind with grit after a muddy assault, requiring careful cleaning that Soviet submachine guns simply didn't demand. The tinny, oily smell when the gas tube warmed, the dull metallic bark of the bolt between bursts, these sensory signatures became associated with both technological envy and practical disappointment. By April 1945, as Soviet forces closed the ring around Berlin, the STG-44 had become something more complex than just a captured weapon. It represented proof of German industrial sophistication, yes, but also evidence of desperation. The stampings and simplified construction spoke of a nation struggling to arm troops as factory after factory fell to advancing armies or crumbled under aerial bombardment. The relatively low production numbers, hundreds of thousands rather than millions, revealed the gap between German ambition and capacity. Soviet troops advancing through German industrial towns saw the production plants firsthand. The Hainel works in Suhl, the scattered component factories. They saw the partial assemblies, the unfinished receivers, the ammunition that would never reach the front, and they understood then that capturing the enemy's best weapon was simultaneously a victory and an epitaph. What they couldn't know yet was how profoundly this captured rifle would influence the next generation of Soviet small arms design, or how the lessons learned from stripped-down STG-44s would echo through Cold War arsenals for decades to come. A workshop at Snaitokmash, Klimovsk, southeast of Moscow. Summer 1946. Under bright electric lights, 3 captured STG-44s lay disassembled on workbenches like mechanical autopsies, their components labeled with numbered tags while Soviet weapons engineers circled with calipers and notebooks. What happens when you hand your enemy's finest weapon to the men who design your future? The real power of the STG-44 wasn't in the hands of the soldiers who captured it. It was in the minds of the engineers who studied it. Soviet weapons designers had been working on intermediate cartridge concepts since the late 1930s, but German production models provided tangible proof that the theory worked at industrial scale. Captured rifles were cut open in arsenals for metallurgical analysis, their stamped steel receivers examined to understand production techniques that could reduce manufacturing time and material costs. Every gas port dimension, every spring tension, every angle of the magazine well was measured, documented, and debated. The Germans had done something the Soviets understood intimately. They had built a weapon for total war, designed for rapid production by semi-skilled labor, using stamped metal instead of expensive machining. The STG-44's wooden handguard could be sanded smooth by soldiers in the field, leaving warm palm print shine that contrasted with the blackened receiver, a detail that revealed how troops personalized their weapons, how steel and wood transformed into extensions of self. But technical study was only half the story. Back at the front lines, the STG-44 had become central to small unit social dynamics in ways that defied official military hierarchy. A captured assault rifle often became the subject of bets: who drank first, who marched with it, who could keep it through the next action. These micro-rituals of masculinity and risk turned weapons into totems of survival. Squad leaders sometimes rotated trophy rifles among their best shooters, creating informal competitions where carrying the German automatic became a reward for valor or marksmanship. Private Ivan Kozlov, whose diary survived in family archives, described an evening in a bombed-out factory near the Oder River in March 1945. "Sergeant Petrov let me hold the captured German rifle tonight. The weight was different. Balanced forward, where our PPS sits heavy in the receiver. The wood felt warmer than Soviet birch, almost alive. When I worked the bolt, it moved like oiled silk. For 10 minutes, I was the envy of every man in our platoon. Then Petrov took it back and locked it in the supply truck, and I returned to being ordinary. 10 minutes of extraordinary. The psychological dimension of trophy ownership cut deeper than tactical advantage. Though the PPSH-41 was cheaper and filled millions of Soviet hands, an SS-issued or elite German rifle was perceived as higher status proof of combat prowess than standard-issue weapons. Possessing an STG-44 signaled that you had closed with the enemy's best units and prevailed, that you had looked into the teeth of German technological superiority and taken their weapon as yours. Visual identification mattered enormously. Many captured German weapons carried unit stamps, Waffen-SS acceptance marks, or carved initials from previous owners. Soviet soldiers sometimes kept these markings intact as grim souvenirs, physical evidence linking weapon to defeated enemy. Museum photographs from the period showed trophy STG-44s with their original German markings preserved alongside crudely stamped Russian inventory numbers. A palimpsest of ownership that told stories more vivid than any after-action report. But what would you do in their position? Imagine, you're 19 years old, you've survived 2 winters of combat that killed most of your training battalion, and you've just pulled a weapon from the hands of a dead SS trooper whose squad had pinned your platoon down for 3 hours. The rifle is warm from recent firing. German brass casings litter the ground. Your sergeant says you can keep it until the next weapons collection sweep. Maybe 3 days, maybe 3 hours? Do you fire it immediately to test it, burning precious ammunition? Do you clean it obsessively to prove your worthiness? Or do you simply carry it, letting the other men see that you are now marked as someone who has taken the best the enemy could offer and survived? The answers varied, but the weight of the question remained constant. By May 1945, entire German depots, rail cars full of crated weapons, were captured intact during the final liberation drives. At collection points near Brandenburg and in the outskirts of Berlin, Soviet trophy brigades documented mountains of surrendered small arms, over 3 million. Usable German rifles and carbines were eventually consolidated into Soviet warehouses. The sheer abundance transformed scarcity into surplus, but by then, the mystique had already been established. The post-war redistribution revealed Soviet strategic thinking. Rather than issuing captured STG-44s to Red Army front units as standard equipment, the weapons were redistributed to friendly states, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Yugoslavia, as military aid throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. This decision reflected both practical logistics, the nightmare of maintaining non-standard ammunition supplies, and political calculation. Better to arm satellite states with captured German weapons than to retool Soviet industry for an interim cartridge that would soon be obsolete. Because Soviet designers were already working on something better, the technical lessons gleaned from captured STG-44s, intermediate cartridge ballistics, stamped metal production, selective fire mechanisms, contributed to qualitative leaps in post-war small arms evolution. Mikhail Kalashnikov's early prototypes drew on direct experience with captured German weapons, though the degree of influence remains debated among historians. What's undeniable is that Soviet weapons testing facilities in 1946 and 1947 were filled with disassembled STG-44s being studied by engineers who understood they were examining the future. The sensory reality of these workshops deserves attention. In a cold Russian winter, the STG-44's stamped metal and lacquered wood gave off a tinny, oily smell when the gas tube was warmed during function testing. The bolt slapped with a dull metallic bark between bursts, different from the rattling chatter of PPSH drums or the sharp crack of Mosin bolt actions. Engineers who spent months handling these captured weapons developed tactile knowledge that blueprints couldn't convey. The way magazine springs fatigued over time, how certain production batches showed better tolerances than others, which components failed first under sustained use. This intimate familiarity with enemy engineering would reshape the Cold War battlefield. But the human stories refused to disappear into technical evolution. Veterans who had carried captured STG-44s maintained correspondence with American and European contacts for decades after the war, forming informal networks of men connected by shared experience with this particular weapon. In 1985, surviving German POWs held a reunion in Austin, Texas, and among the attendees were former Soviet soldiers who had captured German weapons, a strange fraternity united by steel and wood across ideological divides. The STG-44's influence extended far beyond its immediate combat use. The weapon's presence on the Eastern Front had been uneven. Initial limited issue began in spring through summer 1943, with mass deployment accelerating in 1944 as production scaled. Yet, despite relatively small numbers compared to standard German rifles, its psychological impact vastly outweighed its statistical presence. The weapon represented technological change in an era when change determined survival. And perhaps most surprisingly, the STG-44's story didn't end in 1945. Decades later, examples turned up in 21st century conflicts in Syria and Africa, testament to the weapon's durability and the far-reaching tentacles of post-war Soviet arms distribution. Rifles captured in Germany in 1945 were refurbished, stored, transferred to client states, sold, stolen, and eventually found their way to battlefields 70 years later, an echo of trophy circulation that originated in the final days of Nazi Germany. What does it mean when a weapon outlives the nation that built it, the army that captured it, and the ideological conflict that gave it significance? The answer lies not in technical specifications or production numbers, but in understanding how objects become symbols, and symbols become stories that soldiers carry forward long after the firing stops. Berlin, April 30th, 1945. In a shellacked apartment 3 blocks from the Reichstag, a young Red Army corporal named Pyotr Morozov sat on a broken chair, turning an STG-44 over in his hands, while artillery thunder rolled through the dusk like approaching weather. The rifle was empty. It had been empty for 6 days. This is where the mythology of captured weapons collides with the mathematics of survival, where prestige becomes a burden heavier than steel, and soldiers learn that the most dangerous thing you can carry into battle is something you cannot use. Morozov's story was unremarkable precisely because it was so common. He had pulled the rifle from a Wehrmacht corporal during house-to-house fighting near Tempelhof on April 24th. The German had 13 rounds left in his magazine when Morozov killed him, 13 rounds that Morozov fired over the next 2 days in scattered engagements. Each burst a small celebration of technological superiority. Then the magazine emptied, and the STG-44 transformed from tactical advantage into 10 pounds of increasingly useless burden. He could have discarded it, should have discarded it by any rational calculation. Instead, he carried it for 6 more days through the final street battles of the European War, because abandoning the rifle felt like surrendering status he had earned through survival. His squad knew he carried an empty German automatic. They watched him lug it through rubble and up staircases, while they traveled lighter with loaded PPSH-41s and Mosin Nagants. No one said anything, because they understood that some trophies transcend function, the cruel arithmetic of prestige warfare. By war's end, the logistical reality of captured German weapons had become undeniable. Soviet after-action reports from May 1945 documented tens of thousands of STG-44s in captured stockpiles, but also noted the impossibility of integrating them into standard Soviet logistics. Ammunition incompatibility wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a structural problem that rendered the weapons effectively ceremonial outside the immediate aftermath of capture. Quartermasters calculated that maintaining a single captured German rifle in combat service required dedicated ammunition supply chains that drew resources from Soviet-caliber production. The decision to warehouse rather than field issue most captured STG-44s reflected this hard reality. While individual soldiers might treasure their trophies, and some units temporarily incorporated captured weapons, institutional adoption was never feasible. The Red Army fought and won with Soviet-designed weapons fed by Soviet logistics, the unglamorous Mosin Nagants, the crude but reliable PPSH-41s, the practical rather than revolutionary tools of industrial warfare. Yet the psychological impact of the STG-44 reverberated through Soviet military thinking in ways that transcended immediate tactical use. Weapons design bureaus, studying captured examples, understood they were examining not just a rifle but a philosophy, an approach to small arms that prioritized intermediate range effectiveness, selective fire versatility, and production efficiency over traditional rifle doctrine. The 7.62 by 39 mm cartridge that would eventually power the AK-47 reflected lessons learned from German intermediate cartridge experiments, though the degree of direct influence remains contested among historians. What's undeniable is temporal proximity. Soviet designers had access to captured STG-44s from 1943 onward, studied them intensively through 1946 and 1947, and produced prototypes incorporating similar design philosophies by 1948. Whether this constituted direct copying, parallel development, or inspired adaptation depends on which archives you trust and which experts you consult. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, technological cross-pollination accelerated by the intimate examination of enemy hardware. But technical evolution tells only part of the story. The human dimension of trophy culture extended far beyond combat utility. For soldiers like Morozov, who carried empty rifles through the final days of the war, the STG-44 represented something that couldn't be quantified in firing rates or effective range. It was proof of survival against odds that had killed most of his generation. It was tangible evidence that he had faced the enemy's best and prevailed. It was a story he could tell for the rest of his life, assuming he lived long enough to tell stories. He did. Morozov survived the Battle of Berlin, carried his empty STG-44 through the victory celebrations, and eventually surrendered it to a weapons collection point in June 1945. In a letter discovered in regional archives in 1998, he wrote to his sister, "They took my German rifle today. The officer who logged it asked if I wanted to keep the empty magazines as souvenirs. I said no. Some things are better left in Berlin. Some trophies demand too much carrying." The post-war fate of captured STG-44s illustrated the gap between individual attachment and institutional pragmatism. While Soviet arsenals refurbished and stored over 100,000 examples, most never fired another shot in Soviet service. Instead, they became diplomatic currency, gifts to emerging communist governments, military aid to revolutionary movements, tangible symbols of Soviet victory over fascism. An STG-44 captured at Kursk in 1943 might be refurbished in Tula in 1947, shipped to Yugoslavia in 1949, transferred to Egypt in 1956, and eventually turn up in an African civil war in the 21st century. The weapon's durability ensured its longevity, but its symbolic weight proved even more enduring. In Russian military museums today, captured STG-44s occupy places of honor with brass plaques noting "Trophy from Berlin Sector" or "Captured at Königsberg." Museum inscriptions trace battlefield flows through accession dates: 1945, 1946, 1947. Each rifle a frozen moment in the collapse of Nazi Germany and the emergence of Soviet hegemony. Veterans who returned to civilian life carried memories of these weapons long after the physical rifles disappeared into warehouses. Reunion gatherings in the 1960s and 70s featured old men passing around photographs of themselves as young soldiers, proudly holding captured German automatics. The images were always the same: exhausted faces, filthy uniforms, and in their hands, the unmistakable silhouette of technological envy made manifest. For soldiers who faced STG-44s from the wrong end, the memories carried different weight. One veteran recalled in a 1983 oral history interview, "The sound was what stayed with you, not louder than our PPS, but different, more controlled, more deliberate. When you heard that sound, you knew someone with training and good equipment was trying to kill you. It focused the mind wonderfully." The cultural imprint of captured German weapons survived in Soviet wartime postcards, propaganda photographs, and post-war museum displays. The image of a Red Army soldier holding an enemy automatic became a public symbol of victory, distinct from but complementary to the iconic raising of the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. Both images communicated the same message: we took everything you had and made it ours. But victory narratives always simplify. The reality was more complex, more human, more tragic. Thousands of Soviet soldiers died carrying weapons they couldn't reload. Others survived specifically because they abandoned prestige for pragmatism, discarding empty German rifles in favor of loaded Soviet arms. The mathematics of this survival calculus defy easy analysis. How many lives were saved by practicality versus lost to the weight of useless trophies? How many firefights were won because a soldier carried extra PPSH magazines instead of an empty status symbol? The questions persist because the human impulse they reveal persists. We are all, to some degree, Private Morozov carrying his empty rifle through the rubble. We all face moments where prestige and practicality diverge, where the symbol becomes more important than the substance. The Soviet soldiers who captured German weapons faced this choice in its most extreme form. Do you carry the tool that works, or the trophy that proves you've earned the right to choose? The STG-44's legacy extends beyond Cold War arms development and museum displays. It represents a moment in military history when technological innovation intersected with industrial collapse, when superior design couldn't overcome supply chain failure, when individual ingenuity met institutional inertia. The German vision of an army armed with assault rifles founded on production limitations and material shortages. The Soviet vision of capturing and studying those rifles succeeded, but the real victory wasn't in battlefield seizures or depot inventories. It was in understanding that the future of small arms had arrived, that intermediate cartridges and selective fire represented evolution rather than gimmickry, that the gap between rifle and submachine gun demanded filling. The Red Army soldier who carried an empty STG-44 through Berlin in April 1945 carried something more valuable than ammunition. He carried proof that change was possible, that the future existed in the present if you knew where to look, that survival sometimes meant recognizing when to release what you've captured and move forward with what actually works. Pyotr Morozov died in 1987, outliving the Soviet Union by 4 years. In his apartment in Smolensk, his granddaughter found a single corroded 7.92 by 33 mm Kurtz cartridge in a drawer of war souvenirs. Medals, photographs, letters from the front, one round, empty, unfired, carried home from Germany 42 years earlier.